Everyone has a different favorite C.S. Lewis work. My favorite nonfiction work of C.S. Lewis's is God in the Dock, which you can see we're doing 3 whole weeks on at the end. That's pretty clear. I think it deserves it. I'm not even doing them all myself. I'm willing to share. But my favorite fiction book of C.S. Lewis is The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. My whole goal in life is to get an oil painting of the ship, the Dawn Treader, to hang in my house. The book that impacted me the most, I mean, it's hard for any kind of modern American Christian to not say Mere Christianity. I mean, I remember my friends reading it in college and them getting their faith really being kind of revitalized, sharing the gospel with me and bringing me to Jesus. And so I didn't read Mere Christianity and it didn't bring me to Jesus, but the guy who brought me to Jesus did so because he read Mere Christianity, right? So if you're going to say impact on my life, that's pretty hard to beat. But if there's a book that's the most C.S. Lewis, where the C.S. Lewis is turned up to 100, he's the most human, because it's about the death of his wife. So I'm really excited to go through this tonight. So I'm going to hand out a copy every week, and I was trying to think of how do I know who to hand it out to? And then I was realizing, okay, this is kind of morbid, but it's a book about death. So does anyone remember, last week we talked about when C.S. Lewis died? And if you know the answer and want the book. Oh, well, if you want the book and know the answer.
Was it September 1963?
Not September. You got the year right.
August.
Not August.
October.
It was the day Kennedy died.
July. Definitely not dead.
Lane wins. Bradley, you got the general gist right. Can I chuck this book at you? No, because he's a fan of books. Can you hand this to Mr. Evans? Yeah, Mr. Evans would never let me throw a book. Okay. November 22nd, 1963. And if you're wondering why I know that, yes, it is because I'm a huge Kennedy conspiracy theorist, although I do think he's dead. Not that conspiracy theory. If you ever want to talk about it, I'd love to talk about it. It's extremely unimportant and doesn't matter at all, which is why it's fun. Those are the most fun conspiracy theories, when it doesn't matter and, who cares? C.S. Lewis died November 22nd, 1963, but I think it was 9 years before that, I'm trying to remember the right day, is when his wife died. So we talked about this a little bit last week. I'll go over it again. Machen in his youth had a very confusing, probably inappropriate relationship with the mother of his dead friend from World War I. When Lewis eventually converted to Christianity in the early 1930s, he seemed to really strive to put the sinfulness of that relationship behind him, including literally welding the door shut in his house so he wouldn't be tempted to go into her room. He did make a vow to his friend before he died that he would take care of her, so C.S. Lewis did take care of her until she died. I think it was 1941. She was famous as being this really unpleasant, cantankerous old woman at the end. And then C.S. Lewis lived a life of a bachelor through World War II. We mentioned this last week. He was a world-class scholar. A lot of his scholastic works are still used at Oxford and Harvard. Very brilliant man. He also, during World War II, we talked about this with like the radio addresses that became Mere Christianity. That's when C.S. Lewis gets bigger and bigger. He starts writing a lot. A little bit before then. And so eventually, as a writer, Joy Gresham, she was an editor and a writer on her own. And so they started a correspondence. And the introduction to this book, the foreword in that copy, is written by Madeleine L'Engle, who wrote, I was going to say Wheel of Time, thank you. I was getting confused with a really bad fantasy series by Robert Jordan. Don't worry about that. Madeleine L'Engle wrote a series of time. Her foreword to this book is just really, really bad. I don't like it. It's kind of a famous foreword. I think she deeply misunderstands what C.S. Lewis is writing in the book. But I love A Wheel in Time. The introduction is written by Joy Gresham's son, who was C.S. Lewis's adopted stepson. right? So he writes the introduction. It's wonderful. He does a really good job introducing both his mom and C.S. Lewis kind of to us as a reading audience. We talked about how everyone called C.S. Lewis Jack. And so we know in this conversation between the two of them, C.S. Lewis wrote that Joy was the only woman he ever felt like was his intellectual equal. I don't think he meant that misogynistically. Well, maybe, I don't know. I don't know the guy. His point was he was just kind of in love with her mind. And that's kind of how their friendship started, right? Was these really deep conversations. She was famously super bright, super sharp. She did the same field. She was a great writer. So she eventually becomes a Christian. She's starting to write a book on the Old Testament. She converts through that. She goes and visits England to do some work. She comes back and finds out that her husband's basically leaving her, is abandoning her. Her marriage is over. So she moves to London. Even though C.S. Lewis is there and they're really close friends, they basically don't see each other for a couple years because C.S. Lewis hates London with like a white-hot passion. He talks about it a lot and kind of drops those nuggets in his book. It's like me with Los Angeles. Eventually, she moves closer to Oxford where Lewis is and gets to know the Inklings. And their friendship really starts to kind of blossom deeply. They become really, really close friends. So we mentioned this last week. The curious thing about their marriages is she is about to get deported. She's in England and like she's overstaying her welcome with the government, not with the British people. And also she gets a cancer diagnosis. And so almost as an act of friendship, they get married. It's a civil marriage, right? So they're very fond of each other. They're very good friends. It is not like a hyper-romantic relationship when they get married. It's very odd. But over the course of that civil relationship, they end up falling very deeply, very passionately in love. And they kind of end up getting remarried again. And in the kindness of God, she has her cancer fades away for a little bit. So they get a couple years, not very long, several around their years before her cancer comes back. And she eventually dies. And so Grief Observed is C.S. Lewis's journals about her death and what he's feeling. Her son makes the really good point, before we get into it, that the article is really important in this title. It's a grief observed. It's C.S. Lewis's grief being observed by C.S. Lewis. So it's not meant to be some like Christian handbook on grief, or this is how a Christian should grieve. And actually to treat it that way, I think cheapens how really deep and wonderful it is. It's just C.S. Lewis being really, really honest about really, really deep grief. And in that, I think it's just a tremendous gift to the church, to anybody who's ever lost someone. And so kind of in the spirit that C.S. Lewis's book is it's his grief observed. I'm not going to make it about myself, but as I kind of walk through this, I'm just going to weave in, because I came to a grief observed when my mom passed about 10 years ago. No, sorry. Would have been 8 years ago. 8 years ago. So I was pretty young. I mean, my mom never met Catherine or Owen. Elizabeth was just a year old when she died. She died of cancer. My youngest brother was 18 when she died. It wasn't sudden, but it was cancer, like Joy Gresham. He calls her H in the book. That's her first name. Helen. I'm already forgetting what her first name is. But so I read this when my mom passed. And it's kind of famous for being a book that's passed around when someone you know dies. And what was so fascinating about it was C.S. Lewis was writing so personally about his experience that he didn't want people to know it was him. So it was actually published under a pseudonym. That's why he even calls his wife H instead of Joy or even J. So I think that personal nature of it's really important. So I'm going to weave that in a little bit too. It has 4 chapters. Kimberly and I were just talking about this. This is not a book that you should read halfway through. It is Lewis's journey through grief. No one's journey halfway through grief is going to look great, or it's going to look like where they want to end up, right? So it's very, very true with this book. If you read it after this thing, if you haven't read it yet, you got to finish it. It's like 60 pages. It'll be totally worth it. Do not stop halfway through. I kind of want to break up 3 really good things that I got out of, I think people should get out of this book, and then 2, I don't want to say bad things. We talked this a lot last week about our heroes having clay feet, and the best way of honoring them and learning from them is admitting where they have faults and working through those. I don't know, Doug's going to have to do that with Mere Christianity. Sean's going to have to do that with Screw Tape Letters. So we're going to go through 2 of those kind of foibles or hurdles of C.S. Lewis, which I think will actually make us understand grief even more. So number 1, the thing that C.S. Lewis pulls out of this is that grief is destabilizing. Now I have to write destabilizing on the board. I should have practiced that at home. So you really get this in the first 2 chapters. And again, this is why it's such a gift at just how honest he was. These are really just his journals that he's writing and processing his grief through. And kind of my favorite part in the whole book is the last chapter. He goes, this is the last journal I could find, and I'm not going to go buy another one. Like, I'm moving on. Like, I'm not going to keep being in this moment. But that just goes to show how much grief is destabilizing, right? And it's very C.S. Lewis. He has a couple really wonderful kind of word pictures of that. One of the things he says that I thought was really wonderful is how grief is similar to anger. He goes on to say grief isn't anger. It's not that I'm angry at God, although he is, and we'll get into that. It's not he's angry at himself, although he is, and we'll get into that. He says that grief is like anger, right? Because he compares it to when his wife was alive, there were all these streets he could go down. There were all these options and all these choices to take, and now he's in this cul-de-sac. And there's always this impending sense of something's going to come. Something's going to happen to me. I don't know when it's going to happen, and I don't have any control over it. And that's exactly what fear is like, right? If you're afraid of something happening, losing your job, getting in a fight, getting in a conflict, that's what you run through, right? When you're afraid, what do you run through is all of these different situations. Well, I think C.S. Lewis is exactly right. Grief is like that, only the things that you keep running through are even scarier because you have no context for them. When am I going to break down crying? When am I going to remember her out of nowhere? When am I going to kind of forget something about this person I care about? Right? When is somebody going to say something that really kind of messes with my brain? So I really appreciated that thought that they're both kind of the situation where if you're angry or if you're grieving, like a lot of things happening to you. And that's destabilizing because as human beings, I'm deciding what to order for lunch. And then I'll decide where to go after that. And I'll decide when to go to sleep and I'll decide when to wake up. And grief is something that happens to you. You especially in the early stages, you do not have a ton of control over it. So I really appreciated his honesty in that. One of the great, amazing C.S. Lewis word pictures that he paints is he says he is swallowing all the time. But if you've really grieved something, you just kind of know what he means. You have a lot of mucus. You're crying all the time. You're constantly kind of gulping for air. You're constantly tired. Right? That's one of the things we kind of go through the book is I'm just tired, I'm exhausted. And so you're yawning. And it just paints this picture of someone whose grief is someone who's swallowing all the time. Like, man, I would have never thought to put it that way. But really the point is, right, is that grief is destabilizing because it's the human experience kind of ratcheted up to an 11 out of 10. Everything you feel either extremely severely, Lewis talks about, right, or you don't feel it at all. Right? I have no joy right now. None of the things that made me happy make me happy. Or I'm overwhelmed. And so grief is really destabilizing. There's lots of word pictures of that. What should be the answer? I'm just going to have to keep it down here. I think what C.S. Lewis shows us is that the Christian response to a destabilizing grief is communication. He says really early on, the worst thing is when I'm alone. That's the absolute worst. I hate when I'm alone. But he also say, I hate talking to people. So he says, what I really want is for everyone to just be around me talking to each other. I think that's beautiful. And I think, by the way, that's more or less exactly what Job's friends do before they fall off the rail. Right? Job is full of lament. His kids are dead. Unimaginable grief. His friends travel from afar. It says they sit there on the ground with him for 3 days. They're just there with him. And so even Lewis admitting, I don't want to talk, he's not actually saying that's good. And that's a really important lens for the book. Just because C.S. Lewis says something in this book doesn't mean he believes it's true or good. He's processing it in a very raw way. Right? So when he says, I don't want to talk to people, he's not saying that's good. he's just being honest. He's like, I don't feel like talking to people. But what we really see is that one of the best ways to handle how destabilizing grief is to communicate. I want to talk to the person. One of the very first small groups I was in that was really, really helpful to Ash and I's faith, we talked about a lot, was at a church in Tucson we were members of. And it was great because we were the only young people for a while. Everyone else, I told the story, had 7 kids. There were 5 couples with 7 kids. And so we'd literally be at someone's house, there'd be 35 kids running around the backyard in Tucson, and then us. So awesome, so exactly what we needed. Eventually, a young couple joins. And I had known him, I had worked with him, I liked him a lot, he was a good guy. And he was a child, and that child, when it's born, is dying. Any really idea that would happen, right? Like the baby delivers, and then all of a sudden the doctors are running and screaming, and the moms and everyone's freaking out. It was really sad. And so eventually this baby, after 2 or 3 days, goes home to be with the Lord. The baby dies. And went to the funeral at Cat Foothills, the big kind of Reformed church down there. And there is nothing as sad as a casket that a baby's in. It is so small. Such a stomach punch, and the brokenness of this world and of sin, and just this isn't right, and it's so hard, right? So we were kind of friends with him, but not super close. And so they grieved, and then I remember not seeing him very much. Like they'd be a small group, and then eventually they came back to small group, and I sat down and I remember thinking, don't bring it up, don't bring it up, don't bring it up, don't bring it up. My small group leader, Dave Britton, who's my hero, says, how are you doing with Haddon's death? And if I could have thrown my shoes at him, I would have done it. Like, you fool, what are you doing? And they started crying, and they were saying, thank you for asking. The hardest part about this is that no one wants to talk to us about it. It's how hurtful it is. Like, we love our son. You all acting like he didn't exist is like the worst thing. And just the next 2 hours, they just talked about him, right? And they went to this retreat, which was parents who lost young babies. And it was just, the whole 2 hours was just them talking about him, right? And I remember them, and then a couple weeks later, giving testimony to church saying, like, man, we love this church because it's for us. I remember thinking, I didn't do anything. But the truth is, human beings, we were made by language. We were made to use language. We know God through language. We will worship him, covenant him through language. And so the truth is grief is destabilizing for a ton of reasons. But one of the things it does, it threatens to kind of destroy our ability to handle things. And so what Lewis does, he's writing it down. And one of the really fascinating things his son says in the introduction, and you read in the first chapter, Lewis says, I can't talk to the boys about it, who I think were 13 and 15, 13 and 11 when their mom died. And he goes, every time I bring it up, they look at me like I'm insane. Like they're embarrassed to talk about it. And he goes, I don't know what to do. So now his son, who loved him like a dad, says, there's only one thing I want to correct. And he goes, every time I brought up my mom, I did act that way. But it's because I was on the verge of tears. Like I was an inch away from completely melting down. And I wish he had just kept going. Right? But he said a whole generation of British men were raised to not show any emotion. This is keep calm and carry on. This is what English are known for. No emotion, no matter what. Hip, hip, hooray, like keep moving. And I talk about like how destructive that was for him. It took him 30 years to learn how to cry. Because of this really unchristian culture that the British Empire pushed in that respect. And so here's the son saying, man, I wish my stepdad would have talked about it. And the son and the stepdad, C.S. Lewis, saying, I didn't talk to my stepson about it. And the answer was just communication. Right? We are communicative creatures. We're made to live not just but in communion with each other. Right? We're not animals, but if we were, we are herd animals. We're not supposed to be ourselves. And so that's a really good thing that C.S. Lewis draws out. And he draws out in really kind of classic. Number 2, grief is defiant. I think C.S. Lewis did a really good job in this book showing that it's really hard to have any kind of mastery over grief. And he talks about two really fascinating things that I remember exactly as he describes it when my mom died. He says, number one, the only time I don't feel guilty is when I'm losing it, when I'm sobbing, when I'm really giving in to that moment of sadness and I'm crying. Like he goes, it feels honest and it feels good. And then immediately after, I feel the worst and the most guilty I ever did. Because I was modeling, and it was about me, and like she's the one who died, but it's my emotions, and I'm not there for my stepsons. I don't know how to balance that. Like, the thing that makes me feel the most real is the thing that makes me feel the most guilty. Right? And so, I think what C.S. Lewis kind of does is what I really appreciate about him, the Psalms do this too. Grief has this kind of force on us. It's not a force, it's not a thing. It's an emotion. But if you're going through it has this force. The psalmist talks about this. He says, my bones are weary. He goes, I'm being hunched in my grief. I can't stand upright because of the grief that you're causing me. And the psalmist, because of his sin, but read Psalm 32, read Psalm 38, the way the psalmist talks about grief as an oppressive thing. That's what C.S. Lewis is talking about. Like, it's defiant. It has force. The other thing he talks about through the whole book, and is one of the more fascinating elements about this, is this idea of the memory of his wife. And he talks about he doesn't know how to remember her, which is, again, not a real question you have until you're grieving over someone. Would totally be a grandparent. I wasn't really close to the grandparents I lost. I am close to my grandparents. They're still alive by the grace of God. But the ones I wasn't really close to. When my grandfather died, I was sad. I cried. Grandpa Jack was an interesting dude. I was a Christian, he wasn't, so that was an added layer of sadness. You know, you sad and you move on. C.S. Lewis says that's the problem. I don't want to move on. I have no desire to move on at all. And C.S. Lewis is terrified because he's like, but I already feel like I remember her rightly. Creating, C.S. Lewis says this, he doesn't use this word, but the right way is he's saying, I'm making an idol of this person in my brain. I'm thinking of them as this perfect person that only ever agreed with me, and if she was here, she would tell them how wrong they are, or if she was here, she would help me. And Lewis is like, that's not who she was. His delight, he includes like she got a really good burn-in on him. Like she includes it, right? Because there was one point when C.S. Lewis was praising her for her masculine attributes. And she goes, do you want me to run around and tell your friends? Oof, good point. So he's saying, I know that's who my wife was. That's what I loved about her. Turning her into this icon, this idol. And it's not realistic. I feel really guilty. He goes, you know what also really sucks? Is like I already remember her as well as I used to. And he gives this great analogy. And this is really fast. Residual image is something our brain does to kind of serve computing power. Someone you're close to, but you don't see all the time, your brain kind of creates a picture of their face. And when you look at them, you kind of see that picture. And so the way I would say to look at this is if you have elderly relatives, an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent, next time you see them, like really look at them, and you're going to see things that you're like, that looks different. They look really different than I realized. Right? And it's because you kind of create this residual image. Well, that's all I have now of my wife, is this image I've created with her. And I know if I were her for 5 seconds, I would already have a totally different view of her. But I don't have that. So that like grief is this defining, and what I really about a grief observed is this kind of long-running debate he has with these journals. He doesn't have an answer by the end of it. He kind of goes back and forth. Maybe it's good that I don't remember. Maybe it's bad. Maybe it's just not my fault. There's no resolution on that issue, which is so good because the Bible doesn't give one. C.S. Lewis, we're going to find out, does not mind going beyond what the Bible says, but in this, he's very humble, and that's a really, really important part of grief. Is I would say, let the Lord. You're not going to be able to master your grief, so let the Lord do it. him be the one that dictates the pace. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to, just at family camp. I won't say her name, but there was a woman there, a very sweet, elderly woman there who just lost her husband, and they had been married for like 40 years. And she had lost him, I think it was 2 years ago. So when she came up and we were talking about it, I was trying to give her pastoral advice. And at first, she said, "Oh, my friends are just telling me I'm not grieving deep enough." I said, "Okay, well, and I tried to point her to some Psalms that were full of grief. And she goes, "Yeah, no, I did that for like a year." I'm like, "Okay." Well, I'm like, "Well, do you?" I was like, "No, yeah, I talk about him. But like, I just feel like I'm at peace with where he is. I'm at peace with where I am. The Lord wanted to keep me." And we talked for 30 minutes, and I realized she's not the problem. Her friends are. Which just happens a lot with grief. I wasn't the only one. Her friends wanted her grief to look a certain way. And so I had to tell her, "Sister, sounds like you've grieved really well, and the Lord has given you some mastery over it. And it's the Lord's mastery, it's not yours. You weren't doing some kind of weird trick, like refusing to think about him. You weren't carrying a little icon of him around with you. You processed it normally, and the Lord gave you some peace. Let other people fall unclean. What the Lord has called clean." Right? And so it's really important in grief to let the Lord master. That means you can't decide, "I'm not going to be sad anymore." It just does not work like that, right? You don't have, right? I think that's really, really important. The third thing, and I think the most helpful and the most challenging part about this, Lewis shows us grief. So, if you do a tiny sociology study here. If someone hasn't read it, read the first 2 chapters and then call me this week. Just the first 2 and then call me and tell me what you think. You will hate it. You will hate this book. You will hate C.S. Lewis. Because in the first 2 chapters, C.S. Lewis hates God. Hates God. And it's coming through. And C.S. Lewis is fascinating because he doesn't say, he talks about this. He's like, am I tempted to say God doesn't exist? He goes, no. And again, this is what I mean by C.S. Lewis is sometimes is most helpful. He even gives this great little story of why not. He goes, you might ask me, like in this grief, why am I not tempted to believe God doesn't exist? And he goes, it's an impossibility for me. Like, he goes, if God didn't exist, then my wife didn't die. The collection of atoms just got dispersed. And that's all we are. None of us are people. We're just collections of atoms waiting to be found out, he calls it. I was rereading that Monday and it hit me like absurd. He even talks about that the naturalist, evidentialist world is. We don't grieve over groups of atoms. It's so anti-human, transgressive to think of human beings as this collection of stardust that's like assembling, and then it's foul, it's disgusting, it's absurd. And Lewis is like, I can't even bring myself to believe that. Because then why am I so sad? She's just this collection of atomic dust away. That's not who she is. I knew who my wife is. She was a human being with a soul. I'm not afraid, she doesn't exist or God doesn't exist. He goes, I'm not afraid of that. Because what I am afraid of is that God exists and that he's cruel. And that's what he really works through the first 2 chapters. Right? Is his question. He comes up with a couple different terms for this God that he's now, Lewis, what I'm scared about is that I've actually really met God now. I didn't know him before, but now I know him. And this God that just makes me go through real terrible moments for no apparent reason, that's who the God I think exists. And he says, I'm terrified of him. He calls him a couple different things, this God. One of the things he calls him is a vivisector. Did anyone have to cut open frogs or animals in science class? Okay, yeah. That's vivisecting, right? When you cut open something, right? So that's what he's saying is what I'm afraid of is that God exists, but that he is this vivisector. Here, let me quote. This is right after he talks about how silly it is for his wife to have been a collection of atoms. No, my real fear is not materialism. It's were we, or what we mistake for we, could get out of it. says, I could kill myself. It's like, I don't think that would. I am more afraid that what I really am is a rat in a trap, or worse still, rats in a laboratory. Some I believe God always geometricizes, supposing the truth is that God always vivisects. Sooner or later, I must face the question in plain language: what reason have we, our own desperate wishes, to believe that God is, by any standard that we can conceive, good? Grief is dark. And by dark, I mean it clouds the face of God. It clouds the face of God as if he's not there, or if he's there, but he's silent and he's angry. Now again, C.S. Lewis is moving through grief, right? We talked about this. It's destabilizing, it's defiant. So there's even a part in this chapter where he goes, I'm crying out to God, he's not there. Like, I'm knocking on the door and the door is shut. He says, and I don't know what to do with that. But then you keep reading. Because he kept going to God. It didn't make sense to him, letting the Lord process his grief. And he says, I think it's in chapter 3 or chapter 4, he goes, what I came to realize was, it's not that God was silent, it's that I was not listening. And he compared himself to someone drowning, laughing out. And I've used it, this is pastor's favorite sermon illustrations. If you ever get lifeguard training, you have to specifically get saved how to save those people. Because when you're drowning, you start lashing out violently. You're punching your would-be rescuers. You're dragging them underneath. One of the most dangerous things in the world is a drowning human. It's really hard to save. And Lewis says, that's what it was in my grief. I was lashing out. God was speaking. I wasn't listening. Right? And then he gives, I think, last week I said my favorite C.S. Lewis analogy was from The Abolition of Man, but rereading it, it's definitely this. I think it's in chapter 3. Or, I'm not going to spell veterinarian. I can't. So Lewis says, I am in my grief. And he says, at the end of the day, what I realize, and this is so profound and necessary when we go through grief, Lewis finally comes to realize my emotions don't define the truth. And is there something we all need to hear more consistently than that? My emotions don't define truth. If anything, our culture likes to proclaim more than that. Your emotions, your feelings determine what's true. And Lewis is saying, what I found in grief that's destabilizing and defiant, he talked about this. He's like, what I believed yesterday, is it less true now? If it's ontologically, universally true, did it become less true because my house of cards fell apart? The problem, Lewis said, my house of cards. Was it my construction? And Lewis gave a brilliant word picture of a cat that's taken to this table in an office. And the cat is put on the table, and it freaks out. Oh man, I wish Corbin and Courtney were here still. Courtney, she was a groomer at PetSmart. She knew exactly what this was like. Our poor dog. You guys haven't seen her. She's like 80 years old. She's the nicest dog on the planet. You guys, if I brought her to PetSmart, she would turn into like a raving Mongol lunatic. Like Attila the Hun into when it comes to get groomed. So if we take this cat and we put it on this table, and the cat loses its mind, hissing, clawing, fighting, desperately trying to kill the person holding it, what does that tell us about the person holding it? And Lewis says nothing. Because the person behind the table could be a vivisector, about to tear the cat apart. Because that's why the cat's freaking out. Or it could be a vet. And that's why the cat's freaking out. So C.S. Lewis says, me, I'm realizing I'm the cat. And my emotions do not dictate what's true. In fact, they are uniquely, they're not wrong, but they are an unhelpful guide to truth. Right? And so, now, I think this is a really good point for us. Character of where we need to go in this really wonderful, really raw book with where C.S. Lewis, I think, hit. So what C.S. Lewis does is he realizes that as though his emotions are important, he's working through them. He's like, I can't be the ultimate arbiter here. Right? He goes, there's no way I can believe God doesn't exist. I know God has to exist. I'm processing through whether or not I like him right now, because I'm lost in this grief. But God has to exist, and therefore, he has to be the standard of my emotions. What's so fascinating about that, one of C.S. Lewis's greatest failings as a Christian thinker was that he didn't always let God have the final say. C.S. Lewis is a brilliant man, a wonderful Christian. I'm excited to hang out with him in heaven. But C.S. Lewis was a very smart man. He knew he was a very smart man. And his progress into Christianity, we talked about this last week, and I kind of left it hanging for now. What you probably didn't notice was a Bible verse. Not to say C.S. Lewis didn't love the Bible, but C.S. Lewis, he read George MacDonald, he read Chesterton, and he considered the emptiness of postmodernism and of the idea of creation without a God. He's like, rationally none of these make sense to me. And he said, I was the most unwilling convert. I think that Christianity came from God who loves sinners like me. So C.S. Lewis gets the gospel, gets God. But even when C.S. Lewis came into Christianity, it was largely through his own mental study and effort. He actually had something called the Socratic Club at Oxford, where he would invite people into his study, and he would tell them, if you come to my house for 3 weeks, I can reason you into Christianity. And that's why Martin Luther, we talked last week, they knew each other, they were friends. That's insane. That's totally against everything the Bible says. I mean, Pilate was begging for that. Right? Caius Veritas. What is truth? We are not computers. And because we're dead in our sin, this is not a switch. Smart English student in Oxford can flip it. Lewis definitely struggled with that. He had a really high view of his faculty's understanding. So as much as I think Grief Observed is this wonderful testimony to the depth and the reality of grief, and his honesty about how he's struggling, even when he's honest about his God, I think is such important for Christians to see. Because I don't say this with joy in my heart, you will grieve. Someone you love will die. And if you are married, one of the two of you, he talks about this in the book, one of the two of you will die first. And someone will be left with just really deep, serious grief. So his wife says, that was true when we signed up for it. And Lewis says, that doesn't help. And he's right. So what I love about this book is how radically honest. I mean, he reminds me so much of David and the Psalms, Lewis does. So honest about how hard grief is, about how deep it is, about how much reaching for God. Lewis is really honest with God. And by the way, I want to commend you this. I don't think Lewis was less honest with God. I think he wouldn't have gotten to as good of a place. I'm not saying it's okay to curse God as a bad theologian. But to be honest with God, the psalmist does this. Where are you, God? Why are you hiding your face from me? I am calling out to you, and you're not answering. C.S. Lewis says all those things in A Grief Observed, and they're word for word in the psalm. So being radically honest with God in your grief is the best thing you can do, because he can take it. He can handle your grief. He can handle your doubts and your faith. In fact, that's exactly what you're supposed to do. Kind of end this really great thought where he was like, he's trying to process, I had this great marriage, why was it taken away from me? And he goes, in my grief, when I'm letting my emotions me, I go back to God as this great vivisector. Like, you're happy. Not on my watch. And he takes it away. I know that's not true. Every joy I've ever had has come from him. As if realize it's because God said it's time for the next thing. There's something new. Now it's time for the next new thing. Man, is that the best message for someone in grief? There's another new thing. Nothing yet God has for you. And this marriage, your parent, your child, this age is gone now. And Lewis does a really good job with that. He says, we need to be really careful not to treat heaven as this thing that prevents or blocks grief. Right? It's true that a grieving mother can look forward again, but she will never again have the joy of being that child's mother. She's never going to get to time how to ride a bike. That's gone forever. And ignoring that is equal to good religion. And it's true. Well, good religion, all Christianity has ever been, is your relationship with your covenant God. And so what Lewis kind of gets to is, don't trust my emotions. Bring this to God. who has a purpose in what he's doing, and search for a real answer to that. Don't be glib. Oh, it's going to be fine. We're going to have search through the answer through it. Here's the coda I'll add to it. Everything is doubly true for when you have a loved one die who's not in the Lord, which was the case with my mom. I shared the gospel a lot. I know the chair in our kitchen. I know the couch I was sitting in. Actually, you guys have been to my house. That table, I sat at that table with my mom in those chairs and told her about Jesus when she had cancer. You gotta believe. Like, life is a veil. No, I just can't. I can't believe a God who would do this to me. I thought, do this to you. Him. And so even in the hospital, she's dying, and she starts going like this. I'm just desperately hoping she's doing the sign of the cross, which as Protestants we don't do. Mom, do you want me to pray for you? She took out on a piece of paper, and she wrote, she underlined it. She couldn't speak because the tumor was blocking her throat. So that was the last thing she ever said to me. The last thing she ever said to me for Christian, who was 3 or 4 at the time. He wasn't there. I think you understand why. So then she passed. So all of the kind of glib, just don't think about it, it's going to be okay, you're going to see her again, she's in a better place. None of those I could say to myself. I mean, I could. But one of the benefits, and Lewis talks about this grief of faith, is like, I'm interested in the truth. It's one of the things Lewis loves most about Joy is, like, man, she wanted the truth. And she found it in God. And by the way, it's really cool. I think you get in this book. I'm just throwing all these strays. It's such an interesting book. How much her faith really built up his. Because there's so many times he's struggling, and he's like, she wouldn't like me to say that about God. She would tell me I'm wrong, so I'm wrong. She knew that God was good, and how much that lifts him up, which is. We're here, you guys, because we care about the truth. Like, if I didn't think this was true, I would not be here. I couldn't be here. Right? So I can't now just say, oh, my mom's in a better place. I don't think she is in a better place. I have no reason to believe that. So I went to my favorite teacher, R.C. Sproul, who had, and I talked about this. Someone asked him, what do you do? What do you do? And R.C. Sproul answered, God mercy. And what does that mean? Does that mean, my beloved didn't say that? I said, it's mercy. And that's the only thing you've ever been able to hope. The only thing you've ever been able to bank on is that God is mercy. Bank on it now. God will be merciful to you. God will bind your wounds. God will keep you, love you. God will shelter you. He will gather you like a chick under his wing. And then at the last, you will see him. And because you're with him, it will be okay. And so R.C. says, I don't know what that looks like because I'm not, but I will know. When I'm there, I will be with the God who is mercy. And that makes it okay. And it did for me. It does right now. I do not know where my mom is, but I know that God is mercy. I know that he's only been merciful to me every second of my life. And that I with God. The character of God is the balm. Now, that's where I think Lewis struggles. Is that Lewis far too often falls prone to. So Lewis is really good about saying, my emotions, my current thing I'm going through doesn't define me. Because in the process of the book, you watch those things change for him. You watch him change feelings about things like how to remember his wife, how to talk to his stepson, should he hang out with his friends, go to their favorite pub. These things change in these short 4 chapters. That can't define what's going on. God has to define what's going on. But Lewis's problem is, man, my handwriting is just terrible. And that's the question Lewis gets wrong again and again. Now, C.S. Lewis loves God. He loves Jesus. Comes through. One of the few really good kind of theological things C.S. Lewis does in this book every time he's really struggling with the justice of God, how is this fair? Lewis always goes to the cross. He goes, but Jesus. What Jesus died. What Jesus submitted to God. And he says, in brief, each one of us are in Gethsemane, which is really profound. Really, really good. When we're grieving, we're in Gethsemane. But what I would say to Jack is, what did Jesus say in Gethsemane? Thy will, O God, not mine. Jesus was the best theologian who ever existed. Jesus says, Father, your will. You define yourself. And that's what we have to do in grief and in all of life. And Lewis just kind of frequently, this is a pitch he falls off all the time. So who defines? Or the one kind of hurdle that they observed, one thing I would want to tell is not you. You don't get to define God. And you see him wrestling with this. I appreciate his honesty and his rawness. God's a vivisector. He's not fair. You don't get to define God. And this really comes through fascinatingly in chapter 2, when C.S. Lewis takes a brief detour amid his grief to bash Calvinism. He's like, my wife's gone. I'm really sad, but Calvinism is the worst. And you're like, oh, cool. It's like just the other day, I was at a doctor. I was like, you know what? I hate Anglicanism. I didn't do that. C.S. Lewis was an Anglican. I was silly. It's in chapter 2 where he talks about, one way out of this is to be a Calvinist. What I could simply say is that God is so much impossibly bigger than me that whatever he does is right. And therefore, my first impulse has to be to believe that God is bigger than me, he's better than me, and to get truth out of that. And I'm reading that, I'm like, did he become a Calvinist? And he goes, that's stupid, and I hate it. You're like, ugh. You guys, what's C.S. Lewis's amazing anti-Calvinist argument that changed theology together and none of us are Calvinists anymore? I don't like it, is C.S. Lewis's answer. I don't like it. He literally says, I have a definition of good, and if I can't, what are we doing? What are we doing, bud? What are you doing defining the Creator? What are you doing defining the All-Father? Who are you, oh man, to answer back to? You are smart, Jack. You are not that smart, man. And so C.S. Lewis just leaves on the floor the character of God. That he is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and end. And by the way, let me just tell you this. That is the answer. That's two really big answers in grief. Is Revelation chapter 21. Jesus says, I'm Yahweh. I am the Alpha and the Omega. I am before all things. I am above all things. I am the Alpha and the Omega. I am the beginning and the end. To those who are thirsty, I will give water for life without payment. Right? Revelation 21 is Jesus saying, I am the answer. I am God. I am not like you. And I'm making all things new. And that's your hope. And what the promise in Revelation 21 is, I will wipe every tear from your eye. But Jesus grounds that promise in his omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, in his not being like, we are not Alpha and Omega. There is a hospital in this city that's like, this is when David was created. He didn't exist. Say, okay, it was actually, but still, there's a, what does God say to Job? Where were you? The foundations of this earth. When the morning stars sang for joy at the glory of my work. Where were you, Job? And so C.S. Lewis, love me, brother. C.S. Lewis, I understand you have a definition of good that you come to rationally. You don't get to define God. And Jesus says that in Revelation, Alpha and the Omega. I am the definition. And because I am that God who is infinitely above you, who is not like you, that's why you can trust I will wipe every tear from your eye. And the picture of this, by the way, in this book, is C.S. Lewis's absolutely bizarre obsession with purgatory. Where he goes, I just can't believe that a sinner like me and my wife could die and get to go straight to heaven. Dude. Yeah. Again, I just don't. C.S. Lewis basically says, I have that idea. We have to go to purgatory for it. And that's part of the reason, by the way, his grief is so bad in this book. He's like, I know my wife's in purgatory right now sweating out her sins. So there's some bad theology in this book. And sometimes when he pushes, like, hey, don't tell me my wife is happy right now because she's not. You want to go, you're wrong. Your wife agrees with me. Purgatory is insane and unbiblical and direct to the thief on the cross. I will be with you in paradise. So theology matters. And when we rebut C.S. Lewis theology, we're not dunking on him. We're not showing how much smarter we are. Look at what are caused by bad theology. He is deep in totally unnecessary grief because he thinks his wife is being punished for her sins right now. And there's not a single Bible verse that comes within a million miles of suggesting that. But it's because C.S. Lewis has this rationalistic, I have my understanding, and my wife was great, but she was a pretty big sinner. She really has to go to purgatory first, which is destructive. The other thing I think C.S. Lewis on. Okay, so we have to go to the character of God. Who defines God? Not you. This is a layup Sunday school answer. What defines God for us? The Bible. Really missing in A Grief Observed. The comfort of the Word of God. Matter of fact, most of the time when C.S. Lewis is walking through Bible verses, it's to kind of say why they don't apply to him. Actually, one of his friends rebukes him and says, don't grieve without hope. C.S. Lewis is definitely struggling with in the first chapter. And C.S. Lewis answers, that's for a better Christian than me. Only a really good Christian gets to believe what he's saying. Again, man, you are not the master of these things. The Bible is for you. It is the breath of God. It is totally sufficient, Paul says in Timothy, for all training in Christ. It is for you, man. Who are you to tell God that his word doesn't apply to you? And the thing that I'll just end on this, I'm going a little bit long. The thing that absolutely kills me about this, I think the Bible's two great answers, two great doctrines. And again, be real with God, be honest with God, contend with God, strive with God. He's a real being. He's a real person. Talk with him, fight with him, work through it like Jacob, like David, like Jack. But there are two big verses the Bible wants us to think about. Revelation 21. I am who I am. That's suffering grief. Why does Paul say that we should not grieve like the world? Doctrine leads Paul to say you can't grieve like the world. You can't grieve those without hope. Doing it off the top of their head. It is the resurrection of the Son of God, which is totally absent from this book. C.S. Lewis believes in the resurrection, talks about it at great length. How are you dealing with death and you don't talk about the resurrection, man? And the answer is because for C.S. Lewis, the Bible wasn't the inerrant, inspired word of God. He's like, I think God's word is in it. That's a really common, higher critical view that was really popular in Germany in the higher criticism movement, and C.S. Lewis was a scholar. So he's like, well, they're really rationalistic. I mean, the Bible's like a husk, and there's a kernel of truth in there, and God's word is in there. I believe that, everything it says about Jesus is true, but C.S. Lewis did not believe that the Bible is inerrant the way that we would say it is. And I got to tell you, I say this with no happiness in my heart, he paid the price for it. Nothing good comes out of undermining the Word of God. And especially, for some reason, C.S. Lewis thought the Bible's answer to this problem didn't apply to him. I agree with those who know hope, because the hope that you have is that Jesus walked out of the grave. Said if that didn't happen, then we are to be great among all people. The hope is that Jesus walked out of that grave, that he is alive after he died. The Bible says that's your hope right there. The resurrection of the Son of God. The God over death. I mean, the Bible, through his death and resurrection, he put death to death. Right? So this kind of undermining the Bible, C.S. Lewis has a habit of only causes a lot of problems for him. It cheapens the Bible's answer to the truth. Right? And I had a really good pastor when I was going through my grief do with this. And he "Hey, David, what do you know?" I said, "I don't know a lot." And he said, "Did Jesus rise from the dead?" I go, "Yes." He goes, "Then you know enough." Think about the resurrection. Ask you a question when your grief becomes overwhelming. Did he raise from the dead? And if you're struggling with that, talk to me. There's no reason you should struggle as a Christian. We all struggle with doubt and with like the overwhelming. Jesus rose from the dead. And C.S. Lewis is robbed of that gift. He sets himself as the judge of God's character, and he doesn't see the Bible as the authoritative guide for how to deal with God's grief. And the answer is the resurrection. I'll just end with this. I was in Barnes & Noble buying that book today to give away. If they had more copies, I would have given away. They only had one copy of Grief Observed. Tragedy on its own. Like 50 Joel Osteen books, one Grief Observed. Anyway. Barnes & Noble. So I'm standing in line. There's a big line. And I'm in a Halloween section. And right, if you go to the Barnes & Noble at Desert Ridge, you'll see it in the Halloween section. There's a book called 38 Questions Kids Ask About Death. My first thought is, I am so sick of late-stage capitalism. Like, what a stupid book to have written. Just because things are lawful, all things are not profitable. Like, you're trying to make money off of this. I hope you wise up, whoever wrote this book. But of course I open it. And I want to, come on, like, what's it going to say? Because like 35 of the questions were like, when am I going to die? And I'm not trying to make light of it, but they're very easy questions to answer. Well, everyone dies. How do you die? Well, technically you die because your brain loses oxygen. Anyway, I flipped to the question, which was, okay, but what happens? What happens after you die? And it said, well, technically that's what happens. Then it says, but surely human beings are more than just a body. And I go, ho, 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 jackpot. I mean, this book was written by, I looked them up, like committed atheists, or one's a writer, one's a scholar, like a doctor, very clearly atheists. Just most human beings can't have enough faith to jump ship to that atheist naturalist and saying, like, no, there's something in me. Personality, consciousness. C.S. Lewis has a great diatribe about consciousness in this book. No, there's no way, right? But then it says, but we don't know because no one's ever come back from the dead to tell us. I'm not joking, that's how that book ended. And you guys, I was 2 seconds from street preaching in that Barnes & Noble. No one's come back from the dead to tell us? Are you kidding me? How do you write that down and not even just footnote? Okay, well, there's one, a lot of people say, there's one guy. You guys, it's everything. The resurrection is everything. It certainly has to be everything for your grief. And even if you don't know if your loved one will be resurrected to eternal life, you will be. You know who God is in the scriptures, and that's everything. So, I went a little bit long. Let me pray to close this. Dan can shut off the stream. As always, if you guys want to ask questions, I'm happy to do that. Heavenly Father,